Today's podcast episode is a special one. I sit down with Bill McKay. Bill is a senior lecturer in the Faculty of Engineering and Design at the University of Auckland. He's a researcher, a teacher, and has been a practicing architect. And this is a conversation that I've been looking forward to for a while. Bill has been someone I have gone to for advice and has been a very gracious and generous mentor to me. So join us as we sit through this very special journey. We talk about letting loose in the early days, teaching and mentoring, the ideas of marketing and following a career that might not stick to the set path, as well as issues to do with a New Zealand context of architecture and building. I hope you enjoy this conversation as much as I did. It's a short one, but it's one that's been special to me. Bill McKay, welcome to the show.
Thank you.
I'd love to start off with an introduction. How would you describe yourself?
I came late to academia, but I was a practicing architect, but now I'm a full-time lecturer at the School of Architecture at Auckland University.
And you're very into research, and you're an active researcher, writer and publisher.
Yeah, a lot of people don't realise, particularly students don't realise, architects don't realise, our primary job here is to do research and publish it. Teaching comes second.
Well, in your research career, one thing that I've noticed about you is that you are not afraid to say what you think. And I was wondering, how do you get behind deeply understanding issues for the essence of what they are?
I think I could take that question two ways. One is research. You've just got to do the homework. You've got to read widely, all of those kinds of things. But the other thing I do a lot of is commentary in the media. And there you're basically dealing with a whole bunch of people who have not done their homework, who have got an opinion, but it's not an informed opinion. So I would say that what they both have in common is you've got to do your homework. You know, you can't get an AI to generate something for you. You know, AI has its uses, Wikipedia has its uses, but you know, you've got to really get down in the weeds and verify things.
Yeah. So you've been, you have a show with Radio New Zealand.
Yeah.
And it's called Urban Issues with Bill McKay.
Yeah.
That's been running for the past 11 years or so.
I think something like that. I haven't counted. Yeah.
Yeah, and in more recent years, it's been a weekly thing.
It's fortnightly, but I also do a lot of other media as well. So I might be on another RNZ show, The Detail or The Panel with Wallace Chapman. And I also do a fair amount of News Talk ZB as well. So.
Yeah, and when you look towards deciding topics for your shows,
yeah,
what is the criteria that you look for?
It's basically, I try and, it's my primary job is to comment on political news. So, for example, RMA reforms, reforms to the Public Works Act, all of that kind of thing. My job is to keep on top of that and also explain it to people and kind of give my take on what's going on, you know, whether it's for better or worse and those sorts of things. But the other thing that I frequently do is what we call explainers. So, for example, the council sent letters about the height of fences, and that was in the news. That's a good one because, you know, there's a lot of public interest in that. You know, why can't we just, you know, my home is my castle, my fence is my fortress, that kind of thing. So I explain the background to that kind of thing. And then occasionally I do a few light-hearted ones. So I might do one, for example, on The Brutalist, why I hate it and I haven't even seen it yet, that kind of thing. So you they want a bit of variety in what you do.
What are some of the issues that are more pertinent in more recent times?
It's always good when the government changes. So, you know, at the moment, the previous government was reforming the RMA, Resource Management Act, and the current one is doing the same. It also helps to have a bit of experience as well, because this current government is also trying to loosen up building consenting. And back when I was young and practicing, We generated the leaky buildings crisis. That was my generation's contribution to New Zealand housing. So it's everything tightened up after that, and now it's all loosening up again. And you do notice when you've got a bit of experience and a few years behind you that things are cyclic. Every 15 to 20 years, there'll be a big shift in the way things are. We're thank God, exiting a retro-modern period at the moment. What'll be coming next? Those sorts of things.
What do you think will be coming next?
I think we'll move away from, it's just one of those things that you notice happening in all the arts, music in particular. I think we'll move away from the kind of minimalism of architecture and back into more of a kind of maximalist, kind of anything goes kind of thing, yeah.
Why do you think that?
Because that's the natural cycle of things, art history 101.
Yeah, well, I'd love to dig a bit deeper into this cyclical nature of things.
Yeah.
Perhaps you could explore that with me. What are some of the major
There are a couple of really good books on the topic, because when I was at university, I also did, as well as architecture, I did a few papers in art history and also astrophysics. Two, quite different things. But in art history as well, we do notice that there's a kind of every generation wants to do everything differently from the way the previous generation did. When I was at high school, I didn't like the music that my contemporaries liked. It was all prog rock. And you had to be really skilled as a musician and all of that kind of thing. I just found it boring. When I got to university, that's when punk rock hit. You didn't even have to play an instrument. It was all about energy and attitude and jumping up and down and that sort of thing. So that's an extreme example, but you do notice the same thing in architecture. So when I was first coming out, that was the period of postmodernism. So kind of like you could do almost anything that you liked. We sometimes got some quite over-the-top kind of things. Julie Stout's the same generation as me, Patrick Clifford, the guys at Architectus, Bosley, Cheshire, Raby Thompson. We were all doing all sorts of stuff. And also at the time, there was an interest in national identity in architecture as well. We were coming to the end of that period, and that was replaced by postmodernism. And then suddenly everyone got interested in modernism again. So, we've been going through for quite some time that retro-modern period where kind of basically all houses are a box, a box sitting on top of a box.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. One very interesting thing that you mentioned with names like Julie, Pip, Bosley, and they were all about the same time in your education. The architecture school back in those days was quite a bit different from what it is today.
Yeah, it was actually broken into 3 studios, and each studio had a kind of an ideology. One was quite conservative, one was kind of middle of the road, and one was very liberal.
Brick,
and
steel and timber.
Yeah, and we were all in brick, which was the very liberal one. When I first came to architecture school, those names were not explained very well. So I went into steel studio because I didn't want to, I thought it was about the material. I didn't want to work with boring old brick or boring old timber, but actually those names were derived from the buildings that they were in before we were all in this building here. But the great thing about the brick studio was that it had vertical integration. So all students could work, you could choose any project that you wanted. So we would end up with first years working on the same project as fourth years, which, would be anathema to the authorities that run these institutions today. Just too loose, too radical.
Yeah, just a bit too much of freedom.
Yeah.
Well, where do you think that gets you with sort of the essence of freedom coming into play? A lot of these names that you mentioned were part of the quite radical group, and they do make up the bigger names in the New Zealand architectural scene.
Yeah.
Where do you think that gets you?
I think it gave you a kind kind of an anti-authoritarian approach to everything. 'Cause, I mean, when I was at the architecture, I was a very good student, but I didn't give a fuck about the grades. And my parents were always kind of, when they'd see the grades, it would be, they'd go, I thought you were a good student. There's only one grade we care about, and that's for design. The others, it's kind of, C's get degrees. So I didn't care much about the opinion of other people. I didn't care much about the opinions of staff. I was only interested in what I was doing. So, and I think we don't get that these days. I mean, because you're surrounded by social media, you're surrounded by people that want to comment on this, that, and the other thing. And young people are, and fair enough, young people are kind of very conscious of, who they are and where they are and what they stand for and that sort of thing. And that makes life just more awkward for them, I think.
Mm-hmm. Can you explore that a bit more deeply with me? In what ways does it make life more awkward?
You're just more self-conscious about everything, whereas I was not self-conscious at all. So,
So when you stop caring about opinions of others in the context of studio, what do you start caring about? What is important to you in design?
Well, you have your own. I think it helped me because I didn't come from Auckland. I came from the country, Mahia Peninsula, so I always felt like an outsider, and I think that's quite a healthy attitude to have. I've always felt that I've been standing off to one side, observing what's going on and kind of making my mind up about things. So, which is why I do so much media commentary now, because really. I'll give my opinion. You can take it or leave it. I'm not trying to convince anyone.
Yeah.
Otherwise, I'd be a politician.
It's how you genuinely feel about things.
Yeah, I care about things, but I don't care what people think of my opinions or me.
Right. And how has that been throughout your career? Has that been something quite hard to?
It's kind of. I think. A lot of architects these days, we never talked about branding and strategies and business plans and things like that. So and they're all actually quite helpful things if you want to have a career. So I think it helped screw my career in some ways, being a little bit standoffish and not caring.
Well, in a way, it probably helped develop your career to where you wanted it to be, being more authentically yourself.
Yeah, because I was. You've got so many more opportunities to go do good architecture these days, whereas it was quite difficult back in the day. A lot of the big architectural firms didn't. They produced boring architecture. I mean, have a look at Auckland. Have a look at the buildings that came out of that were designed and built in the 60s and 70s in Auckland. There's not much that's good. And that's why a lot of us, Julie was in a slightly different situation because she was already partners with David Mitchell, but most practitioners had to go off and start their own firms straight away. That's what Pete Bosley and Pip Cheshire did. That's what architects did after a little bit of practice. But basically, if you wanted to do anything interesting, you had to go and start your own firm and do that. But then where are you getting the work from? Mm-hmm. You can't just sit there and wait for the phone to ring. I thought you could. But you've got to get out there and rub shoulders with people and network and socialise and all of that kind of thing. And I was never particularly good at that.
Well, in a very real way as well, what I think is very remarkable is that by you expressing your opinions and critique on works of architecture or issues within the day, that's helped bring it to where your career is today, which is, in my opinion, a beautiful position to be able to say what you really think about things and to be able to advance issues forward.
Yeah, it's not quite as free and easy as that. So, for example, I write a lot for Architecture in New Zealand, and the job of Architecture in New Zealand is to be a shop window for architects. So you can't get away with too much in there, and it's just the nature of the beast. It's the nature of the program. It's because that's why Architecture in New Zealand exists. And I can't be kind of spitting and all of that. You do notice though, every time I do a review in architecture in New Zealand, architects will say to me, oh, you were a bit soft on that building. But then when I review a building of theirs, they always think I'm quite harsh. And basically architects are such sensitive souls that unless you say something like, this is a work of genius that rivals the pyramids, they think you're being a bit tough on them. I've had architects say, you have no idea how hard it is to design a building and get it built. Actually, I do. So, and that's why I've got a bit of a, I go a bit easy on some people because it is bloody hard work, So.
Well, in a way, you can see some of those strands from university as well, which is you start to mistake your work as you instead of something that's separate, sort of an idea that you're working on. So any critique of that work might be misconstrued as a critique on you.
Yeah. Also, when I was at university, we had a very harsh crit system. And it's so much better now because, we always try and be positive and constructive to people rather than, the old style crit was just try and shred someone. And when that work that's pinned on the wall, it comes out of your brain, comes out of your heart. So, you feel part of it,
Yeah, and in a very real way, it's the things that you care most deeply about a situation being critiqued. But it's sort of difficult to keep in mind that it's your ideas being critiqued, not the idea maker.
Yeah, and I do tend to kind of go the extra mile for students as well because, I feel empathetic about the situation that they're in a lot of the time. So.
Well, I'd love to know more about the architecture school back in the 70s and 80s. So talk to me about that.
There's a book you can read.
Yes, I have read it. And the crit dynamic that you mentioned, which was, in your words, sort of aiming to rip people through the crits. Can you describe the cultural difference between back then and today?
You would get, you get some. It was a bit. It's almost like trying to describe the high school I went to you. We got caned. We had corporal punishment. And the idea was that we had to wear school uniforms and caps and things like that. And it was almost like being in the army. And it's just hard to kind of get across to people how times change.
Right, it's a different time, and at that time it was normal, but
and architects would come in and they would crit students in the same way that they were critted when they were at architecture school. It was that kind of attitude where that kind of made me what I am today. So.
Well, in a
getting
way,
beaten up makes you stronger.
Well, I grew up in Dubai and partly in India, so I can relate to some elements of those, although definitely not as intense as what you were describing. But in a way, I think there's a little bit of a danger, perhaps you could say, a little bit of a danger with romanticizing that sort of those harsh days. I think that comes about.
Oh yeah, and I'm certainly not. I mean, it was kind of the high school I went to was awful. I don't even like going back to the town. I'm certainly not romanticising it, but it's often when people are not professional teachers or critics or anything like that, they tend to don't know how to do it properly. I think it's just that. So
well, I'm certainly not accusing you of romanticising those days, but I think within the student body, a lot of the times we think that crits are a bit soft these days, and sometimes we have a yearning for harsh and to the point feedback.
But also we're bound much more about kind of policies and things like that, whereas back in the day there weren't any.
It's the Wild West. It's the Wild West back in the day.
Yeah, pretty much. Yeah. I mean, whereas these days, there are things I'm allowed to say and there are things I'm not allowed to say. We're employees of the institution, and we have to obey the rules.
I'd love to get into a bit of the marketing side of things. So one of the things that you've told me in the past is do the kind of work that you want to get more of in the future.
Yeah.
And I think that ties very well into sort of the whole marketing ploy, which is, well, you've got to put yourself out there in the first case to get the kind of work that you want. But if you aren't established, then it's difficult to get the kind of work that you want. And how do you go from there? Can you talk to me about the tension?
It's very difficult, and I think it's easier these days because there are more ways to get your ideas and get your profile out there. Through we didn't have an internet. It existed in the world, but none of us knew about it. And you've got social media, you've got more opportunities for exhibiting your work, you've got a few more competitions, and all sorts of things like that. So there are more opportunities for you to kind of get a reputation, get a profile, those sorts of things. More international competitions as well, all sorts of opportunities that you've got that we didn't really have. So, and we all had to start off with house alterations. It was that's the great. That's how we all learned back in the day. So
you get your detailing right, and then you can go on to the design.
And it's a good place to kind of learn a few skills because you're also you're dealing with the clients a bit more. You're doing a whole range of things. Whereas you could work for a big firm these days. You might be working in a team, working on a hospital, and you could do 6 months of ceiling details, which is not going to get you very far in terms of kind of the broadening your skills.
Well, certain architects do espouse that, like, that's the way you, I guess, climb up the hierarchy to be able to get to do the design work, to be able to get to do the fun stuff.
I don't know because, there are a couple of, there's one firm that's famous for getting the best young people in there and then kind of squeezing the juice out of them in terms of ideas and things like that. There are firms where young graduates can go straight into doing design. They don't necessarily get their name on the design, which I think is, not good practice, but
it's a satisfaction.
Yeah.
Well, that's what the argument is.
Well, also kind of the architecture school all architecture schools are primarily about design, and that's why we're here doing design and all of that. So the primacy of design is something that you're steeped in for 5 years, and then you go out and find that you're doing ceiling details.
Can you outline to me why design is such a core important thing?
Because that's how, theoretically, it's about how everything comes together. And one of the problems that we always have with you guys is that you see technology or media or kind of any other courses that you're doing as professional practice as separate from design, whereas we're always pushing you to try and integrate it into your design. But your tendency is more to think that design is about coming up with something new rather than it being about a synthesis. And it's both things, but kind of like we tend not to see the synthesis happening to the level that we'd like to see it here. Yeah. And again, kind of like that's not just our view, because a lot of people are under the impression that we just do what we want at the architecture school in terms of staff. No, architecture schools are accredited, and there's a whole lot of professional capabilities that we're supposed to be instilling in you through the course. And if we don't, we lose our accreditation. We're not an architecture school anymore. And it's pointless you coming here because your degree won't count for anything. So people don't both the profession and students don't realise just kind of how, the degree to which we have to do things, whether we like them or not, whether you like them or not.
Yeah. Well, I don't know if this is a bit of a stretch, but the way you describe design as being the place where all of your skills come together, it's almost like an aggregation module. Yeah. It sounds very similar to what essay writing is, for example, to most other degrees. It's aggregating your ideas. You write essays to be convincing, you write essays to advocate for yourself and people under you, and in the same way, design's sort of the Pictionary equivalent.
Yeah,
of
yeah. I think that's fair. And I can remember, I think it was in third year or something like that. I can remember the moment I finished a really good essay, and I thought, I've got as much pleasure out of constructing this essay as I get out of design, constructing a design in the sense of, coming up with and balancing a whole lot of different needs and requirements.
Yeah, yeah, because you're really designing the essay.
Yeah.
It's
Yeah.
not just happening. It's
Yeah.
it's a work of art. You've said to me in the past that architects should talk about issues,
Yeah.
not just their body of work.
Yeah.
Is that a correct quote from you? And can you explore what that
Pretty
means?
much. I'm working with a group of people at the moment. I made a comment about, I can't give too much away because it's confidential, but I made a comment somewhere about this particular site, and this group summoned me to come and explain myself to them. It happens quite a lot, actually. There are quite a few architectural firms where I've been summoned, and it's been carefully explained to me that I don't understand, the issues around why this building is like that. But this particular group, they started off completely the wrong way. So the architect involved there just talked for 15 minutes about himself, assuming I didn't know who he was, and then talked about his design and all of that. And it's the equivalent of when students say, a student said to me the other day, but this is my concept. And it's come up, yeah, but it's a bad concept. It's come up, but so architects can behave, really in kind of like unsophisticated ways, and they're always talking about themselves. So he's sitting there going kind of like, this is my idea, this is that, kind of like, I this, I that, I the other thing. Just kind of, if I'm a client, I'm going, yeah, it's not all about you. It's actually about other things. I might have an opinion on this. You're not even letting me get a word in sideways, etc. So kind of architects just talk about themselves too much. And I always say to students, if a student is explaining their design by going, I want to do this, I want to do that, and if I'm a client, I can go, well, I don't want. It's kind of, if that's the best argument you've got, if that's the best logic you've got for what you're doing, well, I can use the same logic and say, no, I don't want to. So people have got to grow up a little bit and come up with better arguments for what they're doing, and that includes a hell of a lot of people in the profession.
Yeah. Well, it might be the goal that you're aiming to chase always in the right goal to begin with.
Yeah.
And then the question becomes, how do you more authentically find out the right goal?
We're starting to see, the profession has been eroding for a long time, and come up, who knows what AI will do. But for instance, most people know that project managers replaced architects as the leads on jobs, but now we have a subsidiary profession of project managers called design managers. So you're sitting there doing your design, the design manager will come over to you and they'll kind of go, well, okay, just stop doing that because I can see that the budget is not going to go that far, or there's no way we'll be able to order in those materials, and all those logistical kind of things. So,
And all of a sudden, house alterations seem a lot more favourable.
Yeah. I mean, that is one thing about house alterations is you can control the budget a bit better. But on the other hand, people are much more sensitive about the budget. If you're working on a hospital and you blow the budget, well, no one, the client is basically, it's not coming out of their mortgage, it's not coming out of their bank account. So smaller budgets, able to control them more with houses and house alterations, but much more investment by the client in it, both in terms of concern about money. They want to spend more time with you, et cetera, all of those sorts of things. So there are pros and cons of all the work you do.
Why is the profession eroding?
Because architects don't know how to talk about the value of the profession, and the abilities and the skills and the experience they've got, they keep making the mistake of talking about themselves all the time and thinking that architecture is about them and what they want to accomplish. You know, so.
Yeah, it's that almost romantic idea of like a star architect going, "Oh, I had a dream of this." So and so.
And that's why I hate the film The Brutalist, because it's just playing into that whole stereotype. I'm the lone genius. You're like, yes, I know it's not. Actually, it's kind of supposed to be based on Marcel Breuer, and I know it's a work of fiction. It's not a documentary about architects, but it just exacerbates that stereotype that we have. You know, I mean, kind of like, well, architects appear in films and television a lot, but you know, they're always the kind of there is the stereotype that they're kind of creative genius, etc., etc.
Self-absorbed.
Yeah. And come like, ask yourself, if I'm a client, do I want a creative genius or do I want a building, a decent building that works well and on budget, please?
Mm-hmm. Well, hopefully you can get the unison of the two of them.
Well, that's what we're all striving for. Yeah. But it's good. I'm just constantly amazed at, like, for example, the Institute of Architects have never approached me to talk about anything on RNZ. I mean, if I was running the place, I'd be exploiting whatever kind of media possibilities I have. I get other people, I get politicians approaching me, saying, "What about talking about this subject?" and that sort of thing, but not the architecture profession for some weird reason.
Yeah,
they must think they're doing a phenomenal job of it themselves.
Well, it'd be great to be able to justify the value of architects themselves if you had that opportunity to take advantage of it.
Yeah, but also I'm not a gun for hire. You know, so,
You say what you really think. Which is the rest.
Within limits.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well,
because even on something like I've never had editorial control on me in RNZ, but kind of, they don't edit what I say either. But kind of like, you're kind of aware of the social mores and all of that kind of thing. So you can't just kind of rant and because that's not the nature of Radio New Zealand. Sure. The other thing is kind of like I do a lot of commentary on News Talk ZB. They phone me up all the time when there's something, and you do get edited then. So kind of like that's staff often say to me, "How come you do all the media? Can we have someone?" I say, "Sure. Here's how you do it. You give your mobile number to everyone on the planet. You be prepared to drop everything when the journalist phones you because they want it now or within an hour. Be prepared to be misquoted. Be prepared to be taken out of context, and be prepared to be kind of misunderstood by kind of like virtually everyone." I mean, it's the only way you can cope with all of that is to do more of it. Yeah.
You've really shattered that romantic idea of niche fame in a way.
Yeah.
Well, what would you?
But I still do it because I don't know. I've got nothing else to do, I suppose.
Yeah. And what would you say is the worth of the architectural profession? It seems like all of this effort that you've put behind your career has sort of built up to this argument in the background. What is it? Can you outline it for me?
I wouldn't say that because, I mean, what I always try and do, for at least an hour a day, generally from about 4:30 to 6:30, is do my favourite thing, which is writing books. So kind of like it's the happiest time of my day is doing that. Used to be back when I was practicing, back when I was a student, the happiest time of my day was kind of like just sitting there without the phone ringing, doing design, not being interrupted by the builder or the client or anything like that. So Saturday morning, nice. But again, it's a bit like when we were talking about an essay. You construct an essay in the same way you construct a design. So, and that's gotten, writing a book, in history has got nothing to do with anything that we've been talking about so far. So that's my favourite thing to do.
Yeah. Well, that's your major preoccupation at the moment.
Yeah.
Which is,
And also part of that is kind of revisionism as well. So, for example, I'm working on a history of housing at the moment, and most histories of housing focus on what buildings look like. This is not a book about what buildings look like. It's a book about how buildings shape how we occupy buildings, how they shape our lives, and vice versa. So it's basically the history of New Zealand housing is two things: the toilet making its way from the backyard into the house, and the other thing is the kitchen, which has always been the heart of the house, making its way from the back of the house to the centre of the house. That's the history of housing in New Zealand over hundreds and hundreds of years. I haven't even talked about frilly bits on the fronts of buildings, or the difference between the bungalow and the villa.
Yeah. How do you decide what are the most pertinent topics for you to write about and think about?
Sometimes, in terms of a book, you've got a topic, so it's housing or Antarctica or something like that. In terms of when I'm doing something for the media, quite often it's responding to something that's in the news. But if, for example, there hasn't been much in the news lately, so this weekend I have to dream up what I'm going to say for 15 minutes on Monday. So, and I have a little list of things I might drag out, such as films about architects or something like that. And we've got the Resine Film Festival coming up at the moment, so I can tie the two together, and that kind of makes it sound like it's something coherent.
In all of your years of research and practice and study, what do you think are some of the most important concepts and urban issues, trends in Auckland that have been coming up?
Definitely Auckland's getting better. It's, architecture is getting better. So what do I mean by better? Well, architecture is more interesting, there's more variety and approaches to things. Society is allowing us to be a little bit freer and more liberal in what we design and what we do. There's more of an appetite in society for kind of novelty and change and something fresh and something new and all of that kind of thing. Whereas kind of back in the day, society was a little bit more staid about that kind of thing. Clients were very good back in the day of saying, I really like it, I really love it, but in terms of resale value, maybe we should just kind of knock it back a little bit and make it a little bit more conventional, etc., etc. I used to hear that quite a lot.
So when you say there's a lot more opportunity to do good works of architecture today than before, is this what you're referring to? Sort of cultural shift.
Yeah. The culture, society is just much more open to all sorts of stuff. And you can see that broadly in society as well. I mean, we are much less monocultural. We're much more interested in what kind of various other cultures and things have got to contribute to society. Whereas back in the day, I mean, even the way we dressed back in the day, I was a punk, and there were days I wore pajamas and leopard skin pajamas into studio, because that's what punks did at the time. Whereas now, no one will bat an eyelid if that happened. Whereas back in the day, it had a bit of shock value to it.
Yeah, well, it's a funny thing you chose architecture then, because architects are typically seen as, either one side's the more polished kind, but then the other side's like sort of the radical gung-ho.
Yeah, if I had my life again, I wouldn't do architecture.
Really, what would you do?
Airplane and spacecraft design, less bullshit.
And equally as creative?
It's something that's always interested me, and I just think, like some of my favourite buildings, like the Eames House, for example, is my favourite building, because the initial design for the Eames House was going to have a big kind of, they were all doing at the time, big cantilevers and all of that kind of thing. They got most of the materials on the site, and then they went, come on, let's think sensibly about this. How can we just maximise the kind of volumes that we're going to get? And then they rearranged the design. So I like the kind of, there's an elegance and a logic in that approach to architecture that you also see in the design of aeroplanes and spacecraft. You know?
Yeah. And it's very interesting that that you mentioned that, because that seems to tie in well with your career of research and study as well. Is that there is a logic, there is a debatable argument, rather than just saying, as you mentioned earlier, but that's my concept.
Yeah. And in a similar vein, I think, you know, my current favourite New Zealand house is a dog box that Patchwork Architects did, and there they kind of they went on Trade Me. They found some trusses. They designed it all around that, you know, and they had no snootiness about fancy materials. So you've got corrugated plastic, which is the cheapest building product that you can buy per square metre. So again, you've got that same kind of slightly punky, anarchic kind of but logical approach to things.
Yeah. Speaking about Dogbox, we've spoken about Patchwork and that project specifically in the past, in reference to some of the work that I've been doing with my colleagues.
Yeah.
You've always been very helpful and very involved in the professional lives of students, much deeper than just the prescribed education. I'd love to know what motivates that. Why is that rewarding to you?
Just the teaching gene. My parents were teachers, you know, and much as I tried to avoid it, you know, it's just genetic, I think. My sister's a teacher, but she teaches horses. She's a horse breaker.
Well, I have to say thank you very deeply, because a lot of the efforts and a lot of the insights that I've gained from you over the last few years have helped me execute projects and sort of glean my direction a bit better. I think it's sort of sticking to a more conventional route.
Yeah.
Sort of figure out what's more.
There's also you get a pleasure out of seeing people do well, and it's also you know, it's interesting for me to talk to you guys, you know, because you're, you know, generally, you know, most students are very interesting, you know, so it's kind of, you know, I get something out of it as well.
Yeah.
It's not all altruistic.
Yeah, well, I spoke to Rajan here from Chow Hill a few weeks ago on the podcast, and he mentioned sort of your input into his life and career, and I spoke to Sam Baxter from Summit's Chaplin Architects as well, and I'm not sure if you remember these names, but it's definitely true that it's been a very lifelong.
And when I was supervising Sam's thesis, I could see Sam would be a good fit for that firm, and then, you know, so I got him an introduction there, and he's still there and doing really well. You know, so it's quite nice when you're able to do a bit of matchmaking like that.
You're the OG dating app for professionals. So with this involvement in students' lives, I think what's really rewarding is, at least for us, is being able to see that there's not just one prescribed way of doing things.
Yeah.
I think often you just get blindsided by, I need to finish 5 years of school and then get a job, and then you know, try to work my way up the corporate ladder.
It's also as well, when I was at university in this different studio system, the staff were like, you know, you could see what ideologies the staff had. And we've become much more homogenous, you know, and people are less outgoing about having a particular approach or opinion. There are people at Unitec who are much more vociferous about a certain approach to things. So I think we have become a little bit institutionalised here as well. So, you know, I get pleasure out of sitting in the bar, mouthing off in a way that I couldn't get away with here.
You talked about, for example, Claude Makeson having in your book a much more, I guess, conservative, refined approach to design compared to other teachers in the brick studio.
And he was, in my opinion, he was producing clones. Basically, you know, we would walk past one of the crits he was having, and he had a kind of a style of interlocking spaces that he would do, and that's what he wanted from the students. And most of the students in there, that's what they wanted, so that it's, there's no future in that really. So, and you know this as well, a lot of Frank Lloyd Wright students just became kind of insipid versions of Frank Lloyd Wright. They didn't go off and do much that was of particular interest to me anyway.
So a great architect, but not a great teacher, not a great guide.
No.
Yeah, well, that vociferous approach to sort of speaking your mind about your design language or anything in general seems, well, it's risky, but it seems like the only way that things will pay off.
Yeah.
In a way, you probably won't have most people agreeing with you, but then the people that do agree with you, you find your bunch.
I don't mind. I like having a good debate. I don't mind if people disagree with me, but you've just got, and that's the thing that you notice in social media these days. People have just got an opinion, but there's nothing backing it up. There's no kind of logical argument there. There's a lot of ignorance of facts, and even if I read a Herald article, so I subscribe to the Herald online, and there are comments below that. You read those comments, you go, you don't even know what you're talking about, But we're hearing it from politicians as well at the moment. So the minister in charge of RMA reform is saying the RMA is very restrictive in what it allows you to do. That's not true. The RMA says you can do whatever you want to do as long as you don't have a significant adverse effect on the environment. And if you do, you need a resource consent, and then you've got to marshal your argument. And if you can mitigate that significant adverse effect, you can do it. That's how we get motorways built, So that's how we get buildings built in zones where you couldn't build that building. So the RMA is not as restrictive as people think, but everyone thinks it, and it's wrong.
Yeah.
It's expensive and time-consuming, that's for sure, and that's why we need to change it.
Yeah, and the same sort of, I guess, lack of research or lack of context copies and duplicates itself across multiple different issues.
Yeah. And that's why I like doing the history books as well, to kind of get to the root of the real story rather than the kind of So, and that's also why I've always been a bit like, I think of the most significant journal article that I wrote, that was really very revisionist in the way that it kind of addressed issues of time and space to do, in relation to Maori culture. So, you've got the ability to kind of, seek out a kind of a different truth, There's no one truth in the world. There's lots of different truths depending on, who you are, what you're doing and what you want and all of those sorts of things. But
yeah. Well, on that thread, what do you think are some of the issues today that are, or in a historical context as well, that are overhyped, that are oversubscribed to, and might not be as big of a issue as
it's a bit tricky. I think the cult, and this is the retro-modernism. It's really a culture of the aesthetic, more than anything else. It's a very refined aesthetic, but it's devoid of ideology. So back in the day when modernists were being modernists, there was a rationale behind everything what they were doing, whereas retro-modern, there's no rationale there. It's just, that looks good. It's just style, it's just aesthetics. And that kind of, I just find it really boring and dull. So I'd be quite keen to see will that go.
Is there a problem to that, or is it just the lack of argument that?
I think it's just kind of dull to me, because there's no big ideas there. It's just kind of, it's just a competition to have the biggest sheet of glass or the fanciest materials or something like that.
Yeah. Well, talking about ideas, another big part of your career and your life is guiding students through design studios. So AD1 at the moment.
Yeah.
And I'm sure a second studio that you have.
Yeah, third year.
Third year.
Yeah, design 6.
Yeah. So how do you guide? How do you fight the tension between wanting to guide students but not buttressing them?
It's kind of easy here because students forget that they often don't get a choice of topics in other architecture schools. So the students that go to someone's design topic are kind of either particularly interested in that design topic. So for example, in the second semester we'll be designing a whare waka, a canoe house on the waterfront. So you've got to be interested in kind of Maori and Pacific kind of issues and ideas there. So you're self-selecting. So we get on immediately. And then, so that makes it a lot easier. You know, you're kind of preaching to the converted in the way that you wouldn't. So the one I'm doing at the moment is car park, converting a car park into mixed use and affordable housing. So again, you know, people are interested in that, they're different. But I think the main thing that that students are often unaware that we have to do is, you know, so for example, in a lot of my publication, I'm kind of a historian and theorist, whereas kind of often in studio I'm dead practical. And that's because I'm teaching AD1 or Design 6. And those are the two kind of little bottleneck courses in the whole program where you have to get really practical and you have to kind of like really get realistic about stairs and ramps and things like that. So it's horses for courses sometimes. Also, it's kind of, as someone with a bit of practical experience, it's easy for me to do that. And quite often, I think the other thing that I like to do is kind of just tell it to students straight. That's why sometimes students are quite good, senior students like yourself are quite good at teaching first year because you're often interpreting. You know, you get students in first year and they go, I don't even understand what they want from me. I don't even understand, you know, what some of these big words are. So cutting through that is something I quite enjoy. Yeah.
And I'm sure there's a tension between, let's say, when you're discussing ideas with students, and this applies even to those students who have been, you know, the selected who are being preached to.
Yes.
And sort of seeing the development of a project through. You might have certain ideas about where the project might go and an intuition that you've built about where it should go, but a student might you know, not see that yet.
And that's what we want, but kind of like they've just got to have a logical argument to it. So I won't tolerate someone saying, but that's my concept. It's going, okay, well, you know, good on you. You've got a concept. Is it a good concept though? Demonstrate that it's a good concept. Come up with an argument as to why you do it, you know. I was asked to write something for an architecture blog on the language that architects use. So often architects they'll say things like, one of my pet hates is an architect say, I'm just playing around with some ideas. You know, it's just like, am I paying you to play? So, you know, sure, you know, we want you to be creative and we want you to come up with ideas, but you know, you've got to have an argument behind it as well. Otherwise, there's no backbone to the thing. And you need to have a backbone. You need to have a concept. You need to have a good idea. And you need to have a logic behind everything. Because when the shit hits the fan and you run out of budget or something like that, you've got to have something backing up your design to say, well, maybe you need to borrow more money to kind of achieve a decent result. Not kind of like, oh, just, you know, we've saw a little bit off the sausage.
And it goes on that line. It goes deeper as well. You're not just designing a product. You're designing like a system or a framework, a way of approaching things. So if you can't get that source of money, then if it has to be adapted, how is that done? If you thought about those concepts, they might play through.
Yeah. So anyway, you know, we could talk about how you deal with the budget. Some people just kind of shrink everything, put it on the photocopier, and settle at 0.95, you know, just shrink everything. There's a building I was critiquing and they did exactly that, you know, and that trimmed off a whole lot of floor area. So they still ended up with the same building, it was just slightly smaller.
So when you guide students...
this building that we're in right now, if you walk over the road for a cup of coffee and then you come back, you look at the end of the building and it's got galvanised steel on it. That's temporary. That's waiting for the second half of the building to be added on.
Yep. From when, 1970?
Yeah,
all the way
1979.
1979.
Yeah, so there are plenty of buildings around the place that they're half built, for the reasons that we've been talking about. Luckily, this building is a big sausage, so you could just saw off a part of it.
Yeah, a burnt sausage is that. I've seen visuals or just read descriptions of sort of square-like floor plans as the earliest rendition of what the architecture building could have been.
Yeah. There was a lot of architectural input from staff into the design of this building. So it was designed by the same architects that did the original engineering school, and their first concept was kind of rectangles. But kind of because it was the 1970s, we ended up with this big curved building that kind of turns its back on the prevailing weather. And there used to be 2 big oak trees in the courtyard, and it wrapped around those. So yeah, I think it works, and it creates a microclimate down there. So I think it works in terms of form. It works quite well. The university had 1 computer when this building was designed. So actually it's been retrofitted with computers and wiring and all of that kind of thing. It's withstood that. It's kind of loose fit enough. What I don't like about this building is it's got no front door. The other thing about this building, when it was designed at the time, there were very few women in architecture. So the architects kind of went, how many women and how many cripples will we have in this building? Bugger all. So that's why kind of the female toilets, they look the same size as the male, but you go inside them and they double as accessible toilets. So, there are many things about this building that are sexist and racist as well, and all sorts of other things. But, that's what's interesting about buildings, I think, when you kind of do that, when you understand them in that way, rather than, the role of the critic is to kind of tease all of that kind of stuff out, not to stand in front of it and say, I like it, or in my opinion, I think it's good. That's not what a critic should be doing.
Well, that description of a critic sounds very much like the student earlier who just went, but that's my concept. It's a crumpled piece of paper, and I think it's beautiful.
I don't think it's beautiful. What is this word, beauty?
Well, that's what makes everything so interesting, which is the stories behind a time and an era in a way, and buildings are almost like a timestamp.
Yeah, and when I was talking earlier about things being cyclic as well, as part of that, I think it was Robert Hughes, who used the phrase the shock of the new. So when something is new and radical, the public are averse to it. So Impressionism, the Impressionist painters, they were reviled by the public. The public hated Impressionism. Now it's on biscuit tins, although it's on wallpaper, it's on, it's so ubiquitous that it's become dull and boring because, it's like the Mona Lisa. You can't look at that. I can't look at it, and I've done art history, like I say, I can't look at it and appreciate it. It's just too done. You've just seen it too much. Yeah. Same with the sunset, just overdone.
Yeah. Well, there's a common conception, at least among students, which is, hey, I want to design something timeless from an aesthetic point of view and something that will last forever. But by nature, buildings don't last forever. They last a really long time.
Yeah.
Maybe more than you. But.
Yeah, I don't think, timeless is the wrong word. I think we've all got for me, the Eames House, we've all got buildings that always kind of speak to us. But there are other buildings that I loved when I was a student that now I don't like at all. So things do change. But there are other people who say, Le Corbusier, timeless. I mean, a lot of Le Corbusier's work I loved at the time, but not so much now. So.
Well, what is the essence of good architecture to you then?
Well, for me, I think it's different I think it's different for everyone because also if you look at architectural histories, there's a whole lot that is ignored, which is good if your job is a historian, because you can always be revisionist. One of after architecture school, when I was in practice, I got into architectural history through an accident basically because I had leukemia. So I was in hospital and then I couldn't practice anymore. I had to close my office, let go of staff and all of that. And then I got a part-time job at Unitec and became friends with a lecturer there, Douglas Lloyd Jenkins. And he was looking at New Zealand modernism. And at the time, and then I got very involved with that as well, and also the historian scholar Peter Shaw. And New Zealand architectural history, and you can see this in David, much as I admire the Elegant Shed, David Mitchell's Elegant Shed, it's a history of architecture that's very focused on saying what is distinctively New Zealand architecture. So it's all timber and all of that. And he leaves out a whole lot of buildings of the period that were actually New Zealand modernism, international style modernism. So that's where I started off looking at all of that kind of thing. But be careful what you wish for. We hated all that international style modernism in New Zealand back in the day. Now, it's come back to bite us in the form of retro-modernism. So and that's what I mean by cycles of things.
And what are some of those qualities that pass those cycles? What do you think?
I think as human beings, we're mammals. Mammals want novelty. Think of a cat. A cat gets a new toy, a cat plays around with it a lot, and then 3 days later the cat is bored with the toy. Children are the same, we're the same. We want in music and film, in architecture, in design, we want something new. We want something, we want novelty, all of those sorts of things. Fashion's a great example of that. But fashion as well, you can see, the cycle in things. Waistlines go up, they go back down again, they go back up again. So yeah.
But
beards were popular, then beards went out of fashion. Now beards have come back again. So.
You're getting to that very cliche quote of the only thing that's constantly wanted is change.
Yeah. But that's true, because we're mammals, and that's what we want. Yeah.
How would you describe the essence of your career so far, everything that you've done?
I'd say the value in it has been in what I've written more than anything else. And there's probably half a dozen things where I go, oh yeah, this is quite important, and still stands the test when I look at it 20 years later.
Is there a common thread? Would that be understanding of the nature of things, perhaps?
I think with Peter and Douglas uncovering this kind of marginalised international style modernism in New Zealand was one thing, and then I moved on from that to and what's still happening at the moment is a real interest in Maori and Pacific, more Pacific. So, for example, the book on housing that I'm doing at the moment, the first chapter is purely on the first 100 years when Polynesians arrived here. Whereas most books on architecture in New Zealand, get the Maoris out of the way in the first chapter, skip over all of that and then get into the serious stuff, what white people have done. Whereas I'm much more interested in how the Polynesians adapted to New Zealand. And there's not a great deal of evidence, but there's enough to get a whole chapter out of it. And then there'll be another kind of like a couple more chapters as well. In terms of the period, when we write most architectural histories, they see the period before the Second World War as nothing much happening in New Zealand. They see that as kind of waiting for modernism to arrive, and they're ignoring what Maori were building at the time, and the Ratana movement, and Aparana Ngāta, they were making significant contributions to architecture in that period there, but they've been ignored in most histories, or just touched on and glossed over. So I like uncovering stuff, getting the truth out there.
Yeah. It seems like a career full of understanding, I guess, including through your practice and teaching.
Yeah. I guess that, you've got to be a bit inquisitive about what you're doing, and that's also when students are doing design projects, they're generating new interesting things as well. So that's what I enjoy about that. I mean, there's always 10% of them that frustrate the hell out of you, but that's life.
What are some of the things that you're looking forward to? Some of the projects that you're working on at the moment to come out in the near future?
It changes, because there'll be one chapter in which you go, I don't know too much about that, but you find out more about it, and it really gets quite exciting. And I think the key thing that you always have to remember is you've got to be able to get this across to the reader as well. There are plenty of histories and there are plenty of architecture books that are just not very well written at all. So you've got to. Just the pure enjoyment of putting words together is quite fun as well. I tend to use alliteration a little bit too much, but we all.
There's got to be some play within your work as well.
Yeah.
A quote that I heard was, "You're only a true master if you know how to play and not be too serious with your work."
Yeah.
Beautiful stuff. Where can people find you, Bill? How would they reach out to you if they need to?
The whole world, basically it would take you 10 seconds to find my email and my mobile number.
Beautiful. Let's call it there, Bill. Thank you very much.
Thank you.